Alright, the next part is institutional aggression. Now, institutional aggression refers to behavior that exists within and may be a defining feature of certain institutions and groups. Now, there are two types of aggression models in prisons, the importation model and the deprivation model. Now, the importation model was suggested by Irwin and Tracy, claims that inmates who enter prison with particular characteristics, i.e. values, attitudes, and experiences, are more likely to engage in interpersonal violence than other inmates. According to this theory, interpersonal violence in prisons is not a product of the institution itself, but rather the characteristics of the individuals who enter such institutions. Now, research in the U.S. has shown that black inmates, when compared to whites, are more likely to be associated with interpersonal violence. The explanation offered for this is that black prisoners often enter prisons from more impoverished, basically from communities with higher rates of crime. Now, the deprivation model claims that the characteristics of the prisons itself, rather than the prison population, is what accounts for prison violence. Now, they argue that it is primarily the experience of imprisonment that causes inmates extreme stress and frustrations, and which in turn leads to violence or aggression against other inmates and staff. Now, Skies, according to Skies, the loss of freedom and of heterosexual relationships, the isolation from the free community, the boredom, the discomfort, and the loneliness. As inmates experience these pains, they engage in interpersonal violence as a reaction of the hurt that they feel. Now, according to Zimbardo's book, The Lucifer Effect, it emphasizes the powerful influence that situation can have on people's willingness to inflict harm on others. In his Stanford prison experiment, he first noticed that when psychologically well-adjusted college students played roles of guards, they become brutal and abusive towards the prisoners. This study showed that the institutional factors, such as the lack of external constraints and peer pressure, led the guards to disregard the potential harm of their actions towards the prisoners. In the absence of these external constraints, people are at a greater risk of deviating from social norms of conduct. Now, Zimbardo argues that people are also more likely to be aggressive when they dehumanize or label others. Now, some of the evaluations for institutional aggression in prisons include the research that support the importation models. For instance, Harrer and Steffensmeyer analyzed data from 58 UK prisons and found that black inmates displayed significantly higher levels of violent behavior, but lower rates of alcohol and drug misconduct compared to white inmates. They concluded that differences reflected in racial differences in these behavior, with U.S. societies generally providing support for the claim that such characteristics are imported into the into the prison environment. Now, there are limitations to the importation model, however. McCorkle et al. claim that this model fails to provide suggestions for how best to manage violent offenders or how to reduce prison violence in general. The importation model also predicts that membership of a violent gang prior to confinement will result in increased levels of violence and misconduct in prisons, as gang members import their gang involvement into the prison setting. Now, there are also research that support the deprivation model. The largest research in the deprivation model, which was done by McCorkle et al., failed to support its major assumptions. The sample in this study included 371 state prisons in the U.S. and found little evidence to support the connection between violence and measures such as overcrowding and living conditions. Limitations of the deprivation model is when McCorkle and his colleagues also pointed out that levels of stress associated with imprisonment are generally constant, whereas serious outbreaks of violence, such as prison riots, are not. They claim that the serious violence is more a consequence of the management of prisons rather than the general deprivations that all prisoners have to endure. Now, real-life evidence. Zimbardo claims that the same psychological processes that were found in the Stanford prison experiment were also apparent during the abuse of Iraq prisoners in the Abu Ghraib prisons in Iraq. These included de-individuation, dehumanization, group conformity, and lack of supervision, which led to a diminished sense of accountability from guards responsible for the abuse.